All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here today. Good to see some familiar faces and definitely some new faces. Like was already said, my name is Kate Kunkel Patterson, and I'm an interpretive park ranger. I grew up here in the Pacific Northwest, but I've lived, for my job, I've moved and lived in the South or the Southeast, the Mid-Atlantic, as well as the Midwest. So my job's moved me to all those places, but I came back here to the Pacific Northwest in 2020. So I've been back in this region since 2020. As you might be able to gather based on my uniform, I work for the National Park Service. This is an agency that many of you may be familiar with for places like this, the Grand Canyon. Maybe places like this, Yosemite National Park. Okay, places such as Yellowstone National Park. And yeah, the National Park Service, 100%, we're responsible for protecting and preserving these natural wonders, these feats of geology, these gorgeous places that are scattered across the country. But what many people don't know is that the National Park Service has over 400 sites outside of that. So scattered across the country, we care for, we've got over 400 sites. I've been fortunate enough to work at 4 of those sites. The majority of those 400 plus sites have to do with the history and the cultures that make the United States what it is today. So this would include places like the Statue of Liberty in New York City. This would include places like Gettysburg National Battlefield over in Pennsylvania. This would also include the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. and places like Whitman Mission National Historic Site, where I work on a day-to-day basis. And yes, one of these 400 plus National Park Service sites is just 40 miles away. And like I said, I know many of you have been there the last few days if you hadn't been there prior to that. So quietly tucked outside the town of present-day Walla Walla sits Whitman Mission National Historic Site. And this is where I work day to day as an interpretive park ranger. And the bulk of my duties include talking to the public, people who come to visit, whether it's on a scheduled tour, a field trip, or folks who are just out touring around and want to stop in and learn a little bit. This present-day park site is about 140 acres in size, and it sits on land that has been home to Cayuse, Walla Walla, and Umatilla families for thousands of years. And the history that we work to tell there at the park, that I work to tell each day, is complex, it's nuanced, and in my opinion, it's extremely relevant to conversations and situations that we're dealing with in our world in 2024. I have here, what I'm going to go to next is the official purpose statement of Whitman Mission National Historic Site. So this is a National Park Service approved purpose statement. It was done through a big process that all national park sites across the country went through. And I want you to think of this purpose statement as kind of our big guiding light. This is the big umbrella under which all of our other operations must fit. So the official purpose statement for Whitman Mission National Historic Site is as follows. I'll read it to you. At Whitman Mission National Historic Site, the National Park Service is entrusted with preserving a sacred piece of Waiilatpu homeland, interpreting the tragic events surrounding the early 19th century Christian mission, memorializing those who died here, promoting a deeper understanding of the lasting impact of this history, and seeking to heal the associated trauma together with the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. So like I said, this purpose statement is our big, broad umbrella, right? All of the day-to-day smaller things that we do are guided by this statement. For this unit of the National Park Service, as well as for many others, there are some challenging stories, but not challenging in a bad way, challenging in an exciting way. Stories that are complicated and complex and really have a lot of interesting layers. So what I want to do today is I'm going to be looking at this history surrounding that place, that 140 acre spot where I work day to day, I'm going to be looking at that history and kind of bringing all of you along with me. I'm going to briefly outline the basics of what was happening there in the 1830s and 40s. I want to make sure we're all on the same page. We all have the same context and basics of what was going on. And then after we do a little bit of an overview, I want to look at the popular legacy that exists surrounding Marcus Whitman. And we're going to contrast that against his actions and words, right? So his own actions and words. And this contrast, right, looking at the popular legacy and contrasting it with his actions and words is going to prompt us to ask this question. And I'm going to encourage you all to think about this question as we go through this talk, and I'll revisit it again at the end. So the question I'm going to ask, or that this talk will prompt us to ask, is how can a person's legacy blind us to the truth of their actions, of their choices, or of their life? How can a person's legacy blind us to the truth of their actions, their choices, or their life? So that's where we're going. So without further ado, let's dive in. Again, I said I wanted to do a quick overview of this history. We're going to be diving into a specific aspect of this history in more detail once we get through the big picture overview. I like to assume that I don't like to assume what the people I'm talking to know, so that's why we're going to do this big picture overview. So if you've been to Whitman Mission or you're really familiar with this history, some of this might be review for you. But again, I don't know what you all know, so I'm going to get started with the overview. So we're going to start off with the residents, and I mean this in the long-term sense, right? The folks who have been here for thousands of years. We're talking about Cayuse, Walla Walla, Umatilla families. We're talking about other Columbia River Plateau folks, people who are related to or who are ancestors or descendants of the people we see in these photos. Cayuse, Walla Walla, Umatilla, Columbia River Plateau families have been living on the landscape that I work at for thousands of years, as well as in this area, as well as much more broadly in this region. And we're talking residents in the big, the long game, right? Families have been here for thousands of years, and these residents, people who have been here the longest, know this place better than anyone else, right? So these residents are going to be observing and interacting with various newcomers who are coming in, right? So when we're talking about the history that we're gonna go and do an overview for and dive into, we're primarily talking about Cayuse, Walla Walla, and sometimes Umatilla families, all right? So these are the residents. These are the folks who've been here, who are still here. Next, I wanna touch on the newcomers. Two particular newcomers who I'm gonna talk about are Marcus and Narcissa Whitman. Marcus and Narcissa Whitman are both from upstate New York, so they're from the United States. They are both Presbyterian missionaries. Marcus Whitman is a medical doctor in that time period. And they are married. So they're a married couple. It was a pretty quick marriage. They both wanted to be missionaries, but their missionary board, the organization that sent them and funded them, they did not smile upon single people as missionaries. They like to send couples. So Marcus and Narcissa Whitman have this relatively quick, some might call it a marriage of convenience, and they're here as a missionary couple. They're funded by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions to be missionaries out here in the Oregon country, in Cayuse country. American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions is a very lengthy name. It's abbreviated to another lengthy abbreviation, which is ABCFM. So either way, it's pretty clunky. But the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, I want to just take a quick detour here. They only sent missionaries to lands outside of the United States, right? It's in their name, foreign missions, right? And so this is a detail that often gets forgotten or overlooked, is that this landscape was not part of the United States for the entirety of the Whitmans' lives. The whole time Marcus and Narcissa Whitman were alive, this area where we are, where they set up their mission, not United States land. right? And this is underscored by the fact they were funded by a foreign missionary board that only sent missionaries overseas. The Whitmans were not the first or the only newcomers here. There were many others. There were some of which we've been hearing about, right? There were fur trappers and traders through the Hudson's Bay Company. There were other missionaries. There were Methodist missionaries in this area. There were other missionary families like the Spaldings or the Walkers or the Elses. There were also Métis communities like Sarah was just telling us about at Fringetown, right? Additionally, there were Catholic priests who were here acting as missionaries. So there were a lot of other newcomers here in this area besides just the Whitmans, right? So I want to give you this context, set the scene. So if these are our residents and these are the newcomers, let's quickly talk about the what, right? In our big broad overview, what is this? When Marcus and Narcissa Whitman arrive in Cayuse country, it's 1836, and there's a couple Cayuse band leaders or Cayuse leaders who are curious about these two particular newcomers. And the Whitmans are invited to set up their mission and build between where the Walla Walla River meets Mill Creek. So that's where I work today, is that same location. So it's in the Walla Walla Valley, just the next valley to the north of us here. And they set up and they build this mission, right? They're Presbyterian. And for the entirety of the 11 years of this mission's operation, again, I'm going to underscore it. I'm going to say it again, sound like a broken record. But for the entirety of those 11 years of operation, this wasn't U.S. land, okay? They were outside the boundaries of the United States for that time. The missionaries arrive in 1836. They start building their structures, right? One of which you can see, a couple, but one prominently in the image that's on the screen. They start building homes and structures like a blacksmith shop, a grist mill. They start cultivating fields for agriculture, growing crops, planting apple trees for an orchard. The missionaries really are focusing on two elements. These two elements are pretty big and broad. They're focused on religion, okay? They're Christian missionaries, they're Presbyterian. So their goal is to change or to expand people's spirituality and what they believe. The missionaries, the other thing they're really focused on is lifestyle, right? And this is what's pretty big and broad. The Whitmans are really interested in convincing Cayuse and Walla Walla families to stay in one place all year round, to change the style and type of houses that were used, to speak and read and write in English, right? To pick up agriculture and to change what foods are being consumed, that type of thing. So the missionaries are really focused on both religion as well as lifestyle. Sometimes we think of missionaries as solely kind of laser focused on religion, not in this case. The mission was there in that spot for 11 years, and about halfway through that 11-year time period, Oregon Trail immigration, what you all are pretty familiar with, it begins about halfway through that 11-year time period, so right around in the early 1840s. And that Oregon Trail immigration would steadily increase with each year. During this introduction of Oregon Trail immigration, there's a shift in the focus and the purpose of the mission, right? And this is where we get to the title of this talk, right? New mission, same legacy, right? So we're going to dive a lot into that new mission and that new purpose that Marcus Whitman and the mission station have about halfway through that time. But before we dive into those details, the mission does come to an end in 1847. This is the culmination of many years, right? 11 years of tension and frustration. There are requests that the missionaries leave. There are warnings that they should go. And in the fall of 1847, there's a measles outbreak that's spreading really widely and really, really rapidly. So the ending of the mission culminates with an attack on the mission buildings by a small group of Cayuse men. This is in late November of 1847. At the end of this attack on the mission, a total of 13 people were killed, but there were about 50 people who were there at the time who were not killed, right? The people who were killed were the adult American men and Narcissa Whitman. She was the only woman killed. There were about 50 people, the rest of the women and all of the children, who were not killed and who went on to live out the rest of their lives however it worked out for them. After the attack on the mission site was pretty much abandoned. There were no services there anymore. People weren't going off that way from the main Oregon Trail. And news began to spread really, really quickly. It spread back to the United States, and people started reacting. There was this chain reaction back in the US. So news gets to New York and Boston and Washington, D.C., and Congress begins to act. And Congress, within 9 months of the attack on the mission, officially adds the entire Pacific Northwest. They pass the legislation to create Oregon Territory. Oregon Territory is the modern-day states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and then parts of Wyoming and Montana. So it's a huge chunk of land that's added into the U.S. first as territory, and the justification can be traced directly back to the attack on the mission that took place in 1847. Quick note, this image that you're seeing on screen is a sketch done by a Canadian artist in 1847. It's of the mission. It's I think one of 2 images we have of what it looked like at the time. I always tell people, this answers a few of my questions, but it sure does give me a lot more questions, right? It doesn't tell us everything. There are no photographs of what it looked like there at the time. So that's the big picture, right? We all have this background, the basics, the context now. Now that we all have that same foundation, I want to dive deeper into the details and some of the legacy. So let's talk about Whitman's legacy, specifically Marcus Whitman. Most often, when, if you're from the Pacific Northwest, if you know anything about the Pacific Northwest, if you visited, most often Marcus Whitman is portrayed or remembered primarily as a missionary. For most people, that's the first word that comes to mind, right? The broad general public is this idea of him as a missionary. Sometimes we also hear the word associated with Marcus Whitman of martyr. Sometimes we hear the word associated with him of pioneer. Sometimes we hear the word doctor associated with him, as well as a variety of others. Oftentimes he's remembered in likenesses like the one you're looking at, with some creative license taken with this one. Right? And in this area, as well as more broadly in the Pacific Northwest, we see schools that are named after this person. We see streets named after Whitman, colleges named after Whitman. I'm a graduate of one of those colleges, or maybe the only one. But we really see Whitman remembered, and this legacy is created for him as a missionary, right? As a heroic pioneer. And so this is where, for me, I work at Whitman Mission. It is my job. It is part of my role there, is to be very familiar with the history. The history relating to the Whitmans and to the events that took place there. So that's part of my job, is to know a lot about what went down, what happened, and who. So knowing a lot about this history and this person, Marcus Whitman, has really led me to puzzle over the ubiquity of his legacy in this popular sense. There's a part of me that I just, slightly confused, okay? So when we're getting into the choices, the words, and the actions of Marcus Whitman, once you start to dive into what he was doing, what he was saying, what was happening in his world, a different image, an image that does not necessarily match this legacy we just talked about, missionary, martyr, pioneer, a different image starts to emerge. And this image is one that intersects with the interests of this OCTA group, right? This image has to do with Oregon Trail immigration. This image isn't usually included in how we think of Marcus Whitman and his legacy. Okay, so that's what I want to dive into today. I want to introduce to you all the idea of Marcus Whitman, the businessman. Okay. The shift towards this attitude begins in 1842 and 1843. So Marcus Whitman, not as a missionary or a martyr or a pioneer or a doctor, but this idea of Marcus Whitman as someone who's conducting business, as a business person. This shift in his own attitudes begins in 1842 and 1843. And so if we backtrack, right, we just did that big overview, right? We saw the whole big picture of what happened in this history. But if we backtrack before the end of the mission, before the attack on the mission with the consequences, we get to the year 1842. Now in 1842, Marcus Whitman travels back to the United States to plead with his missionary board, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. He pleads with them to continue funding the missions in Oregon and his mission, right? They had threatened to take the money away. He hears this, he travels back to the United States and pleads with them and says, no, please let us keep operating. He is successful in that request, right? So he goes back to Boston, succeeds in convincing the board to keep their funding going. The spring of 1843, right, it takes a while to get between here and Boston. So he arrives in winter of 42 or spring of 43, and then he's gonna come back out this way, spring of 1843. He's preparing to travel back to this area, to the Oregon country, with an already pre-planned wagon train and an immigration for that year. But before he does that, before he travels back out here with that pre-planned wagon train and immigration, he has a meeting with this board, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. This is in April of 1843. And it's in this meeting and the notes that come from the meeting that we see the first tangible, you can hold it in your hands, shift that is very critical, very crucial in Marcus Whitman's attitudes, right? In his focus, in his purpose out here in Oregon country. So in this meeting, April of 1843, Marcus Whitman asked the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions to send an ordained man, because Marcus Whitman he wasn't ordained. He asked them to send an ordained man out with Marcus on that 1843 immigration. He asked for this so that he himself could be relieved of his religious duties here. Marcus Whitman references the demands that Oregon Trail immigrants would make as a justification for this ask that he makes of the board. Right, so he says, can you guys send an ordained man to take care of all these religious duties? Because I know I'm going to have my hands full with immigrants. The board doesn't send an ordained man, so he travels back out here alone. But that ask and that, what he's asking and the justification is a real insight into where Marcus Whitman's head was at that time. He was already planning for a shift in purpose for him and for the mission station here in Cayuse country. He was planning for this shift away from missionary work among Cayuse people and towards becoming a support station or an aid station for immigrants on this new Oregon Trail. Okay. The rest of 1843, Marcus Whitman travels. He does travel with that pre-planned wagon train. He does not get the ordained man from the board, but he secures funding. So he travels back out to Oregon country. He guides this wagon train past his mission site, and he's selling foodstuffs and other supplies to these Oregon Trail immigrants. In fact, he kind of oversells the foodstuffs and supplies. He leaves way too little within their own stock and store for the winter. So the winter of 1843 into 1844, the Whitman Mission Station actually has to rely on food like flour from another missionary. So they oversell their stock and their supply. But this shift in purpose and goals and what his role was and how he saw that solidifies in 1844. So Marcus Whitman takes note of a few things from the immigration in 1843. He notices how much food did he sell to these immigrants in 1843, and how much food were they lacking that winter, right? And so he takes note of these things, and he's going to plan better for the upcoming year, 1844. To prepare for 1844, Marcus Whitman plants way more crops like potatoes or garden vegetables, because these are things that are hot commodities for Oregon Trail immigrants. Right? So he plants many, many more of those crops. He also rebuilds a burned grist mill that had been on site. It had burned down. But he prioritizes rebuilding this grist mill in 1844 to prepare for that immigration and to prepare for the need for flour and cornmeal that the Oregon Trail immigrants would likely have. So he really prioritizes, as he's looking into 1844, he's prioritizing this business, this economic interest of what do I need to provide to Oregon Trail immigrants, and what do I need to do now to get us there by the fall. Marcus Whitman writes about this solidification of his purpose shift, right? His shift in focus. He writes to a fellow missionary in May of 1844. Marcus Whitman writes, "I do not know how much longer we shall be called upon to operate for the benefit of the Indians." Okay? So we're seeing in his own words this change in his purpose, right? And how he's thinking about his role and his goal here. Whitman also writes to his supervisor, or his, I guess you could say his boss. That label doesn't fit super well, but his supervisor at the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, also in May of 1844. He writes, "Indeed, I am fully convinced that when a people refuse or neglect to fill the designs of Providence, they ought not to complain at the results. The Indians have in no case obeyed the command to multiply and replenish the earth, and they cannot stand in the way of others doing so." All right? And again, Marcus Whitman writes to his in-laws also. Oh, I can go back if you want. I see someone taking a picture. I'll leave it here. Marcus Whitman writes to his in-laws also in early 1844. And he says, "It does not concern me so much what is to become of any particular set of Indians. I have no doubt our greatest work is to be to aid the white settlement of this country." Okay, so 1844 is really, really when we see this focus and this shift. It's in, now it's not just in his attitude, right? It's in his words. He was a prolific writer, so we have it in his own words. He's focusing less on that missionary work towards native populations here and on his business, right? Marcus Whitman, the businessman. With the grist mill back to full strength, right? It's a priority to rebuild this grist mill. Whitman was able to charge immigrants the following prices for flour and cornmeal on that immigration of 1844. So for 100 pounds of flour, which seems like a lot of flour, for 100 pounds of unbolted flour, that's like a lower quality flour, Whitman was charging $5 per 100 pounds. For bolted or higher quality flour, $6 for 100 pounds. He also charged $4 for unsifted cornmeal, or meal as it's sometimes called. Unsifted, again, is a lower quality meal. And $5 per 100 pound for sifted cornmeal. Okay, so that's what he was charging folks for, and again, this isn't per pound, this is per 100 pounds. And this is in 1844. I wanted to translate those into 2024 dollars, right? Because I don't know what 1844 dollars are worth. I had to look that up. So when we translate this into 2024 dollars for comparison, so for the same units per 100 pounds, $5 in 1844 of unbolted flour would equal about $209 for 100 pounds of unbolted flour today. The higher quality flour, $6 in 1844, would be about $251 in 2024. For the low quality cornmeal, for 100 pounds at $4 in 1844, you have $167 in 2024 money. And then for the higher quality cornmeal at $5 per 100 pounds, in 2024, that would be about $209 for that same 100 pounds of high quality cornmeal. So again, this is, I think this is insightful in terms of cost, what was being charged, but also, this was a need that he was filling, right? As a good businessman, he saw a need and he wanted to fill that need. But this got me wondering, again, how much does 100 pounds of flour cost today, 2024? Because I don't know that. So I went and I looked at how much a 5-pound bag of flour costs, just like a normal average grocery store price for a 5-pound bag of flour. I multiplied that price for one 5-pound bag of flour to get 100 pounds. And for reference, the cost of 100 pounds of flour, now this would likely be the higher quality flour. 100 pounds of flour in 2024 costs roughly $115. Like I said, this can give us an idea of his business, of how he was structuring this business, and also it really reinforces this distinctive shift that he's made, right? This change in focus. The successes of his business, selling supplies and crops and food to Oregon Trail immigrants in 1844, moved Marcus Whitman further away from that original goal, the purpose he came here with of missionary work, and move him more towards being, solidified as a business person. He reinforces this idea in a letter, again, to his bosses at the board, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. This is in a letter to the board in the spring of 1845. He says, "Situated as we are, necessity compels us to become suppliers to immigrants, and we may as well make the best of it we can." But a change was ahead for Marcus Whitman in 1845. The immigration of 1845 would be the first with a new route through the Umatilla Valley. The Umatilla Valley was this new route between the Blue Mountains and the Columbia River, and it's about 40 miles, it's right where we are, right? About 40 miles south of Marcus Whitman and where he had his mission and he had his business. Many immigrants in the immigration of 1845 took the Umatilla route for a variety of reasons. So that meant that fewer were taking that 40 miles to the north, right? Taking that detour up to Whitman Mission. So this means Marcus Whitman is seeing less foot traffic for this sales, the sales of crops and supplies. So what does he do? He packs up his wagon with supplies, with food, with flour, and he travels to the Umatilla Valley. Sometimes he goes to the Grand Ronde Valley, and he meets the immigrants where they are to sell those supplies to immigrants as they're traveling, right? If they're not going to come to him, he's going to go to them. Like many businessmen, in doing this, Marcus Whitman will mark his prices up. So we have here Marcus Whitman, so again, holding with this flour example, okay? We just talked about how Marcus Whitman was charging $5 for 100 pounds of the unbolted flour, okay? That's what he charged people who visited his mission site, $5 for 100 pounds at Whitman Mission. When he traveled over to the Umatilla Valley, he marked that up. Same 100 pounds of flour, same person selling it, but now it's $8. This is a $3 difference. But again, this is a $3 difference in 1845 money. So what does that look like in 2024 dollars? In 1845, like I said, it's a $3 difference in price, in markup. In 2024 dollars, that same $3 difference would be a difference of about $115. So you're getting the same 100 pounds of flour. If you buy it at Whitman Mission, it's $115 cheaper than if you were to buy it when he's traveled to the Umatilla or Grand Ronde Valleys for it. Again, I think putting it into 2024 dollars kind of reiterates the fact that this puts him solidly in the arena of, he wants the mission to be self-sustaining. He wants to make money as a businessman to continue these operations. After the successes of 1845, he does well. Marcus Whitman continues to justify this change in purpose, right? His purpose, the purpose of the mission. He continues to justify this change in purpose. However, he does start to get some pushback, not just from local people, residents, Cayuse and Walla Walla families, but he gets pushback from his board, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. The American board writes to Marcus Whitman a response, and I'm going to read it in just a second. Fair warning, it's a long response. But they're responding to Whitman's letters to the board from the fall of 1844 and the spring of 1845. But this response doesn't arrive until 1846. So he's telling them about this change in purpose, what he's doing out here, supplying food and crops and stuff to immigrants. And the board writes back, "We are glad to hear of your prosperity in secular matters, and that you may be able, by means of your grain and your stock, to defray a large part of your expenses. All this is well. Still, we are not quite sure that you ought to devote so much time and thought to feeding the immigrants, and thus make your station a great restaurant for the weary pilgrims on their way to their promised land. Such a work is very humane and good work, but the work of guiding men to Christ is a better one and coincides better with the vocation of a missionary laborer. We fear the effect of this on your own mind and heart, that you will become too exclusively a man of business, and upon the Indians, that they will have their thoughts engrossed about improving their outward condition, while they will be led to think their spiritual interests are of little consequence. There is danger also that your mission, like that of the Methodists, will get the name and character of a trading or money-making establishment, and thus bring discredit not only on your own station or mission, but on the missionary work generally." This is the response from his own missionary board to his activities, what he's telling them that he's doing. They're not pleased. He's a missionary. And they see from his letters and accounts and what's happening, they see this same shift, this same change that we've been talking about. Marcus Whitman continues with this path despite these words from the American board. By the fall of 1846, the immigration is smaller. Whitman is left with a lot of unsold supplies and food, and he's not able to get the mission to a self-supporting or self-sustaining status in 1846. Reasons for the smaller immigration might be people branching off to go to California, or the Applegate Trail that goes across the Cascades further south in Oregon. Those side routes take travelers away from the Umatilla Valley. They take travelers away from Marcus Whitman and these wares that he's selling. The selling of foodstuffs continues into 1847. This is the last year that the mission is in operation. And this shift in purpose of the mission and of Marcus Whitman doesn't sit well with the ABCFM, the missionary board, but also doesn't sit well with all the Cayuse families who are in the vicinity. He continues to sell and supply those foodstuffs to Oregon Trail immigrants. And in the summer and fall of that year of 1847, measles arrives in this area. And after 11 years here, various tensions, warnings, and this shift in the mission purpose culminates in the attack on the mission in late November of 1847, right? We talked about the attack. We talked about the consequences of the attack in that broad overview. This attack will lead to this place being forever changed, right? Changing how it is for us still interacting with this place today. But Marcus Whitman's shift in purpose, his change in direction, his shift in purpose in Cayuse country is a distinct pivot. He shows and tells people that he's moving away from missionary work among Cayuse people, and he instead focuses his time and energies on aiding Oregon Trail immigrants. So my question is, why don't we listen to him, right? Why don't we take his own words about what he was doing into account when we think about his legacy? His mission changed, right? His purpose changed about halfway through his time here. However, his legacy is the same. The first word that most people think of is missionary, right? Pioneer. Like we talked about earlier, Americans mostly today often think of Whitman like this. His legacy, like we said earlier, is that of a missionary, a martyr. Some people use that word, a pioneer, a doctor. But why not a businessman? That's what he said he was doing, right? So what I hope is this exploration into his own shift, his own words, this change in purpose that Whitman had, this change in focus he had about halfway through his time here in Cayuse country, I hope it adds another layer to these popular ideas of what Marcus Whitman's legacy is, how we think about him, how we think about his legacy in 2024. As we wrap up, I want to just challenge you. I challenge you to reevaluate your understanding of broader, of people, events, not just Marcus Whitman, but more broadly. I challenge you to reevaluate your understanding of people and events of the past, like Marcus Whitman, with the question that we started out with. How might a person's legacy blind us to the truth of their actions, their choices, or their life? So with that, I do want to say thank you. I encourage everyone to visit Whitman Mission National Historic Site if you have not yet visited. I know many of you have. The National Park Service at Whitman Mission, we're expanding. We're in the process of expanding how this history is told, right? Including more perspectives in how this history is told, to make this history more complete, to give us a more complete picture of what was going on and why it's relevant to us today. This process of expanding started about 10 years ago, and it's been in collaboration with the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. So again, I just encourage you to come and visit, and I want to say thank you a lot for your time and attention this morning.